Hey everybody, welcome back. Dr. Dan talking. Today we're going to talk about a really cool subject, acting and performance in Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. So the subject of the lecture is a simple but fascinating question. How do film actors become their characters? How do they bring us into the lives of these people that they're playing? How do they make us think that, hey, that's not Jack Nicholson, that's this gangster? How do they do that? Well, there are a lot of ways to think about this question, so I'm just going to lay out a couple of guidelines for productive ways to think about film acting. So, some things that you want to spend time thinking about when answering that question, how is this actor constructing this character? You want to be thinking about individual performers' decisions. What is the actor doing with their face? What are they doing with their body? What are they doing with the lines? Like, how are they reading the lines? Are they standing still? Are they moving around? What's the actor doing? What are they bringing to the game? Thing number two that you want to think about is acting in the context of other film elements. So, how is the acting interacting with the cinematography? Are the director and cinematographer framing the performance in a close-up or a long shot? How is the acting interacting with the light? Is the actor being lit in shadows? Because if that's the case, actor probably can't move around too much without interrupting the cinematographer's work. Or is the actor being lit in very, very bright lights? In which case, they don't need to worry about doing a lot of things with their faces because the white lights are going to be so blinding you're not going to see it anyway. What is the acting doing in the context of mise-en-scène? Has the actor been given a literal theatrical stage on which to strut about, or has the actor been tightly confined within a set built specifically for the film? And some of these things are going to affect the performances in really big ways, and other things are going to be affecting it maybe more subtly. But every other thing going on around the performance is going to, in some way, shape, or form, influence what that performer is doing. So you think about how these two things interact. Actors' performances, what they are individually bringing to the table, and what that is doing in the context of what the other filmmakers and collaborators are doing. What are their jobs? Because it all has to add up. So that's two big things to think about when you think about acting. Big thing that you don't want to think about when you're thinking about acting is realism. And I am making a point of dismissing realism as the best criteria for talking about acting, because I think this is what most of us go to as a default. When someone asks us, is that a good performance? We're like, oh, we really believed it. It was realistic. And I think we go to this term because it's just the best term that a lot of us have on hand for describing an effect, a response of belief. Like, we believe that actor is that character, so we say it's realistic. And I think that makes a lot of sense, but I don't think that realism is the best way to describe that experience, because it's really, really influenced by genre. Like the horror film, for example. What is a realistic vampire? Like, that's partly a rhetorical question, but partly a genuine question. Like, what is a realistic vampire? Because we don't have actual vampires that we can refer to in real life. So what are we evaluating Robert Pattinson's performance against when we say, oh, his vampire is really believable? We're not evaluating his performance against real life vampires. No, instead, we're evaluating that performance in the context of a genre's history. And we'll talk more about genres and genre conventions after the first exam. But suffice to say, we're thinking, when we think Robert Pattinson, hey, good or bad vampire performance, we're thinking of him less in relation to real vampires and more in relation to movie vampires like Count Dracula or the Max Schreck character from Nosferatu, the 1922 silent film. Really, really excellent movie. So this is one of the reasons why realism doesn't really work as an analytic term for thinking about acting, is because it tends to ignore that genre component. How so often with movies, and vampires are really just one example. You can also think about, like, literally do this thing with any genre that you like, superhero movies, comedies, etc. 9 times out of 10, we are evaluating that performance not in relation to real life, but in relation to other movies from that genre. And I think the term realism doesn't quite get at that. So that's one of the reasons why I'm dismissing it as an option for this class. Another reason why realism doesn't totally work as an evaluating, analyzing term is because it ignores history. And I'm throwing up some historical images of Abe Lincoln, but really when I say history here in the header, I'm thinking about the history of film acting. And that's what's interesting about the various portrayals of President Abraham Lincoln that have been put on screen, is that they have spanned the history of the medium of film. There are Lincoln imitators in silent films from the 19-teens. And then, of course, Daniel Day-Lewis made history, winning his third Oscar for Best Acting by playing Lincoln in Steven Spielberg's 2012 film, Lincoln. And if you read interviews with these actors, Raymond Massey and Abe Lincoln in Illinois, or Daniel Day-Lewis, or any of the people who've come in between them, a lot of times these actors will tell you, like, oh, we went to the history books and we read, what people said about Mr. Lincoln, what people said their memories were of him, how he held himself, how he talked, how he walked, et cetera, et cetera. And that is certainly informing a lot of their performances. But these actors will also tell you that there's a lot about Abe Lincoln that we don't know, because he lived at a time before we could, follow the president around all the time with a camera. And so they've had to fill in the gaps of the historical record with decisions about what the audience is going to believe. And those decisions, the actors would tell you, if you really press them on it, are going to be motivated by what is in vogue at the moment in the realm of acting. So Daniel Day-Lewis, I'll start with the more familiar example, is a method actor. And method actors, that's one of the hot techniques in acting, and has been for the last 50 years. It's a process where the actor looks deeply within themselves and draws upon personal memories and strong emotions and things they felt very deeply in their own lives, and they bring that to the character. And so you notice the emotion, and it seems to be authentic and spontaneous, because to some degree it is. To some degree it's the actor bearing their soul and letting you see what's inside. But that has nothing to do with who Abraham Lincoln was, right? Like Daniel Day-Lewis, like looking within himself to express the pain of a father whose son has died very tragically. Like that didn't happen to Daniel Day-Lewis, but like he's looking within himself to express that pain, and that pain that you're seeing is authentically his, the actor's. But it's giving you insight into that character, but it's not quite the same thing as saying that Daniel Day-Lewis is like channeling Abraham Lincoln, right? He's channeling his own emotions and feelings while dressed as Abraham Lincoln and while reading dialogue that is written for Abraham Lincoln. But that's not the same thing as saying that he excavated Lincoln's own feelings and is like letting us see the president from beyond the grave. Contrast that performance with what Raymond Massey is doing in Abe Lincoln in Illinois. This is a time when method acting is not the big style. The big style is much more to create a character through external gestures of voice and intonation and body language, less so than looking inward within yourself to transmit your own emotions in the context of playing this character. So when you look at that performance in that film, it doesn't have any of the interiority that Daniel Day-Lewis's performance has. You don't really get the same sense of Abraham Lincoln at all as being a wounded, suffering, deeply emotional man. You get a much more conventionalized, great man, with conviction, leads, marshals the troops, and so on and so forth. And you look at that film today and you say, that doesn't seem like Abe Lincoln. That seems like an actor playing Abe Lincoln. And that's obviously what's going on. But here's the thing. You look at the reception of this film in 1940, and you see that people loved it. People thought it was like the most, badass portrayal of Abraham Lincoln they'd ever seen. It was nominated for an Oscar, a huge critical hit. And that's just because the style of acting at the time tended towards a more externalized performance, one that was more rooted in gesture and body language than in interior emotion. And so again, like the point I'm making here is that when you talk about realism in acting, we tend to ignore the history of acting styles and how dramatically they change from decade to decade. So that's the other reason why I say realism doesn't really work, because there's so many different styles of acting that have been used over the years, and they've all been seen as truthful and authentic for different reasons at different times. So we can't really talk about realism. So what should we talk about when we talk about acting? Well, this is why I asked you to read that wonderful Richard Dyer article from his canonical classic book, Stars, which is a book all about film stardom and how it works in the context of film narrative and Hollywood as a performance, or as an industrial dream factory, a commodified system of production and distribution, all that stuff that Bordwell and Thompson say it is in the textbook. But what is but breaking it all down, the reason I'm making you read this particular chapter from this book is because it offers what I think of as one of the best breakdowns of the actor's toolkit that I have seen in a scholarly piece of writing. And what Richard Dyer is really doing that is so helpful to us as students of film analysis is he's just giving us a down and dirty cheat sheet of things that actors can use to communicate information about their characters. So this should be pretty self-explanatory, but I'm just going to go through these points one by one just to clear up any misunderstandings, make sure that we're all on the same page. But facial expression. So what is the actor doing with their mouth, their eyes, their eyebrows, their ears, their nose? Like what contortions of the actor's face are happening, and what does that tell you about the character? Voices. Is the actor using their natural voice? Are they throwing their voice? Are they distorting it somehow? Is the voice somehow being distorted in post-production through dubbing, for example, or through the director and the sound people altering the pitch? All sorts of crazy stuff can happen with voices, as you know if you're a fan of voice acting. Gestures. This is anything that the actor is doing with their hands, their arms, their legs, any sorts of movements of various appendages. Posture, very similar. Is the actor crouched? Is the actor slouching? Is the actor standing up very straight and tall, thrusting out their chest? Is the actor lying down? Just all those things. And then last but not least is body movement. So is the actor moving when they're speaking, or are they standing still? Are they running, jogging, crawling, creeping along? Like how are they moving? So those are your 5 signs of performance. So here's what you get to do next. In the media gallery section of the course, you should have a short 5-minute video compilation of 3 different Jack Nicholson performances from 3 very, very different points in his career. And what I want you to do is go and watch that video and try to use those 5 signs of performance to describe as many things about Mr. Nicholson's characters as you can. Because what I want you to see is how the same actor can be using these signs of performance in radically different ways and give you 3 entirely different characters. So go off and watch that, and I think it'll give you a chance to practice using those terms and see how much of a difference these different things can make. Okay, so I am now assuming that you have gone off, watched the clips, made a few notes, and are returning to my lecture. So what I want you to take from the clips, we don't have to do a super thorough accounting of like the various things you might be noticing in the clips. That's something you certainly can do with your TAs on Friday. But I do want to generally kind of note that the first clip from Chinatown is probably what Bordwell and Thompson would call the mid-range, quote-unquote, acting style, meaning that most of the things that you see are that Nicholson is doing with his various, his face and his body language and all that is calculated to be around the middle of a spectrum, with one side kind of being like really exaggerated and over the top and the other being very, 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 very subdued. So that's kind of like the mid-range performance. Batman would be much more, by contrast, on the extreme side of that continuum. So in that clip, you saw Mr. Nicholson doing a lot of communicating of stuff through very, very like extravagant body language, like spinning around, jumping, laughing. He's being overly communicative of his emotions through outlandish gestures and exaggerated facial expressions. Whereas in clip number 1 from Chinatown, it is much more restrained and much more like what I said, what we think of as kind of the mid-range. This is also, of course, is in contrast to the About Schmidt performance, which is much more on the very, very, very subtle, very, very precise, very, very just again, subtle is probably the best word, side of the continuum, because it's a very expressive performance. You see a lot of emotion coming through in the About Schmidt clip, but it's mostly communicated through very, very small things that Nicholson is doing with his eyes, like looking down when his wife is saying, oh, you have all this time now. The way that he kind of leans back just ever so slightly when doing the crosswords. Those kinds of things require a lot of weight in the context of the film because it's such a quiet and slow film. But you can see it's a very, very different thing than what's happening in the Batman clip, where its emotion is being expressed through really bold, extravagant action. So anyway, just some things to think about. Good exercise to try with your own favorite films. So definitely or your own favorite actors. So if you have an actor or a performer that really you're into, try this kind of thing out. It's a really, really great way to start familiarizing yourself with the different things actors can do to communicate emotional information to you. So, a couple of other things to think about when thinking about film acting. And these are terms that come from the Bordwell and Thompson chapter or section of the chapter on mise-en-scène that is specifically about film acting. So if you're looking for my source on this, you have to turn weirdly back to Bordwell and Thompson's section on acting that is in the mise-en-scène chapter. They have this as an element of mise-en-scène. As I've explained, think acting is important enough to warrant its own unique section. but these terms are really still useful, so here they are. But Bordwell and Thompson ask us to think, is a performance individualized performance, or is it typed to some degree? Stereotyped, archetyped? Is this character hyper individualized, or can we put this character into a broad class of other characters who are broadly similar to them? Now, Bordwell and Thompson are deriving these terms from a very, very specific place, which is classical Hollywood cinema. That's their specialty. They wrote an enormous book on classical Hollywood cinema for super nerds like me who do film scholarship, kind of around the same time that they were writing this textbook that you're reading. So that's where some of these terms come from, is classical Hollywood cinema. But in the classical Hollywood cinema, you had a very rigidly segmented casting system where stars like John Wayne, who would almost always be straight white people, men or women, they were at the top of the pyramid, and they got to play the most individualized characters in the film. So in Stagecoach, John Wayne's character, the Ringo Kid, he has this elaborate backstory, these really noble goals and motivations. You get a real strong sense for who he is as a person. He is utterly unique in not just the context of the film. There is no character who he resembles or who resembles him. He's also arguably to a degree unique in the larger context of the Western. So he is, sort of the classic Western hero, but the classic Western hero is always constructed as this, this super individualized figure of myth and so on and so forth. So you had him at the top of the pyramid, and then contrasted to him, you would have actors playing stereotypes. Like you'd have basically Native American actors being cast as the warmongering Apaches that the white heroes fight in this film. And these performances would typically be kind of assigned to extras who were not given any lines of dialogue, were not really like part of the big system of like the big Hollywood kind of system. And they got like those parts. And as you can see, it was a system that was kind of invisibly centered around a racial exclusionary logic, because it was way easier if you were not a white person, if you were a person of color or a Native American. It was way easier for you to get jobs closer to the extra end of the spectrum. So as like extras, as bit players, as kind of like walk on, like have one or two lines and then get out. Contract players, like if you were a person of color or a Native American or anyone who is not white, it was way easier for you to get into Hollywood movie making in that way than it was to get into the upper echelons of stardom. Like that place was reserved for white men most of the time, with a couple of exceptions, and white women too, of course. So this is it's a system that's, you're gonna learn way more about it in your film history courses and other courses that you take as a film major. But it's worth knowing about because so much of this system is still with us, even though we don't have officially anymore a star system that is kind of officially sort of ranking the various actors in Hollywood by like, status and so on and so forth. And even though we are officially, so to speak, moving beyond some of these pernicious trends in representation and casting, like this is still something that's with us. You still, if you look at the stars in Hollywood, they are way more likely to look like John Wayne than they are to look like Chief Whitehorse. So again, something to think about and know about, because it'll really come into play with our discussion of Do the Right Thing in a little bit. Okay, so now I'm going to break down the modern star system, so to speak, in a little bit more depth. So generally speaking, when you're looking at a film or a TV show, uh, you're not going to be seeing the same rigidly structured and regimented system of casting that you did in old Hollywood. Like it's not quite the same system. Actors are not being put under 7-year contracts for a single studio and being restricted exclusively to one type of role based on their boss's perceptions of who the audience will think they will believe. So you don't have that, but you do still have something like a star system in movies today. And what you have are, again, when you look at most films, what you're going to see are actors falling into maybe one or maybe sometimes more than one of these broad categories. So you'll either see stars from film or TV, people who you really know and have a familiar kind of relationship with from other films. You will see character actors from film or TV, so people where you're like, I know that guy. I know him, but you can't necessarily name them. They're a familiar presence, but they don't have the same panache and the same sort of instant recognizability that stars do. You may also be seeing an unknown performer from theater. You may be seeing a film or a TV show drawing on actors from Broadway who have an established following if you go to a lot of theater productions, if you live in New York City or Los Angeles or what have you. But don't necessarily have a big following in movies. And so a director may cast an actor from the theater because they have acting chops, but they don't have an established relationship with the audience. The audience, just generally speaking, unless they go to those productions, doesn't know who these people are. Sometimes filmmakers like to cast non-professional actors. So you'll see sometimes people drawing on members of the local community for key roles. A lot of the time, non-professional actors are restricted to the next category, which is the bit players and extras, like sort of the walk-on parts where you have at most 1 or 2 lines before you're shuffled back into the shuffled backstage, basically. A lot of the time, you'll see non-professional actors kind of given small, like kind of 1 or 2 line roles in films to flesh out the illusion, basically, that the filmmakers are part of this community. But you do occasionally see non-professional actors being used as stars or as supporting roles. So if anybody saw Roma from a few years ago, that is a great recent example of a non-professional performance being inserted into the star slot of that film. So just a couple of examples to further flesh this out. Stars. So here's your stars. Here's another picture of Mr. John Wayne and arguably his 21st century counterpart, Mr. George Clooney. One important thing to note about stars that I have not yet said is that the cliche is to say that stars are always themselves and they can't act. The cliche was always to say that John Wayne was always John Wayne, regardless of whether he was wearing a cowboy hat, a military helmet, or was wearing like something completely different. Like whether he was playing, a completely different character, he was always big, strong, tough, looked you straight in the eye, said what was on his mind. That was always who he was, regardless of what character he played. George Clooney is more likely to play a greater range of characters than John Wayne, who was mostly but not exclusively associated with westerns and war films. But George Clooney, no matter what he's doing, is always suave, charming, intelligent, good-looking. He's just always got those qualities in film after film after film. And this is the same thing with so many other stars that you can mention. So if you list some of your own favorite stars, you will find that at bedrock, strip away all of the different performances they play and all the variations they introduce. At bedrock, most of these stars that you can name are going to be always, kind of broadly speaking, doing the same thing. And this is true even when you start to look at some stars who are known for being chameleons. Katharine Hepburn and Meryl Streep are two actresses who have won more accolades, it seems, than anybody else in history for reinventing themselves in film after film. But even in these instances, when you really kind of strip it down, you see that Katharine Hepburn was often, but not always, cast as an upper-class socialite who would come from a storied background and would mingle with all of the rich and powerful people of her neighborhood. Like, often Katharine Hepburn performances are united around some of those qualities, if not necessarily all of them. And Meryl Streep, of course, is famous for reinventing herself in every single film that she does. But even Meryl Streep, if you really look at her, she is often playing characters who have a certain nobility to them. She's often playing, women who you admire or are meant to respect on some level. You don't often feel sorry for Meryl Streep, regardless of whether she's playing an Iowa housewife in The Bridges of Madison County or Margaret Thatcher in The Iron Lady. Like, she always projects a great deal of strength and conviction in everything that she does. And so the point that I'm making here in talking about stars is to say that stars are stars because they have been able to construct a screen persona that is coalescing or united around just a handful of key qualities. They just get repeated over and over and over again. And that's how they become stars, is because they create this subconscious mental association. It's like a brand. It's like the way Coca-Cola is supposed to create happiness inside your soul when you drink it. When you see Katharine Hepburn or Meryl Streep's name on a poster, you subconsciously know exactly what you're going to be getting from that movie and from that actor. That's what a star is. Character actors is something different. Like, these are the people, as I mentioned, who you see these people in movies and you say, I know who that is. I have seen that character. I have seen that actor before. But you, most of the time, don't immediately know their names. Like, you will know these people's faces long before you know their names. And this is the category of actors where, like, these actors are, sometimes they're really great in star roles. Michael Shannon, for example, on the right, has excelled in the star roles of a number of great indie films that have been made over the last 20 years. So sometimes these people get thrust into star roles, but most of the time, casting directors and their collaborators love character actors because they bring an aura of familiarity to the film or the TV show, but they don't necessarily come with the same degree of baggage and the same degree of extra textual knowledge that a star does. You don't really know too much about these people's lives unless you've really kind of done the Wikipedia deep dive. Whereas a star, part of the fun of stardom is everything about their lives, or so it seems. So character actors are not really in the same strata of stardom in terms of instant name recognizability, but they have a lot of familiar associations with film, and so you can just kind of plug one of these actors into a movie and you will immediately have a whole history of associations that movie can draw on. This is why so many character actors are like scrungy looking white guys, because those kinds of actors can just immediately plug Peter Stormare or Michael Shannon into your movie, and you immediately are like, that's a scrungy looking white guy. He's very scary. Like, and you just immediately kind of puts you in a certain frame of mind. This is incidentally where, if you're looking for a place where the old system of very strictly segregated hierarchies between separating stars from other kinds of actors, like if you're looking for the modern equivalent of that, my argument would be look no further than character actors, because so many of our great character actors are women and people of color who are really, really talented, but very rarely have been given an opportunity to break through to that very top upper echelon of stardom. So basically, like, if you are a talented actor today, but you are not, basically a straight white person who has a perfectly sculpted physique and is just amenable and agreeable to like 95% of the population. If you are not in that very stratified group of people, character actor is about the best thing that you can kind of hope for. For better or for worse, more often for worse in the history of film, if we're really being honest. So you'll have actors like Michael Pena, Giancarlo Esposito, Viola Davis, who are probably some of the most celebrated character actors working today. Viola Davis is arguably even kind of crossing over into star territory with recent Oscar nominations for some films that she's done. But these are people who are, again, like, you don't necessarily know these people's names when you see them in a film. You recognize their presence. You say, oh, I think I've seen this person in some other film. But what you're meant to feel and see is that history of associations. And again, this is why, this is where the racism, the structural racism comes into play, is because lots of times this is a shorthand way of signaling, oh, like, this character is black, so he must be a criminal, right? And it's just a really lazy way for directors to just signal, like, here's a criminal. Like, that's like the lazy kind of way that this device is used. More interesting films are doing usually more with it than that. But even in those films, even in the really excellent films and TV shows like Breaking Bad, for example, which is really, really excellent, really gives Giancarlo Esposito like a lot of great stuff to do as Gus Fring in that show. But like, even there, it's still like, there's still this old system of, we're just going to cast him and the viewer is automatically going to know, because he is a successful black guy who shows no emotion, that he must be up to something, right? So even in the shows and the films where seemingly like the actor has been given so much to do, you still kind of have this old system of casting based on association and stereotyping and race and so on and so forth at work in films today, even though the structures are all different. So that's, again, important stuff to bear in mind for Do the Right Thing, because this is so much at the heart of what Spike Lee is doing with his own casting decisions for that film. But before we get there, just a few more examples of the different types of performance that you can find in film, drawn from the films that we have already seen as a group, but unknowns from theater. I think the best example that I can give you of this phenomenon happening is Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane is arguably the most famous example of a movie that is being produced almost but not exclusively with theatrical performers. Most of the people in this movie had never made a movie before, including Orson Welles. There were a couple of people who had done a few films in Hollywood before Citizen Kane, but by and large, Citizen Kane was most of these actors' first film. They had done a lot of theater, and so that's one of the reasons, in addition to all the other reasons we talked about for deep focus compositions, like one of the reasons they frame these shots these ways, partly because these are theatrical actors and they are accustomed to having the whole stage. They were having the whole range, freedom of movement at their disposal to create their characters. And so they recreated that as best they could, in part by having deep focus compositions. So a good example of how casting a certain type of actor can end up resonating with and reverberating against other decisions that the filmmaker has made. Non-professional actors. We talked a little bit about this in discussion sections, but best example of a non-professional actor from a film we've seen is Katinka Untaro's performance from The Fall. Now, she was a 4-year-old girl at the time that this movie was made, and the story goes that she did not know English. She was learning English at the time, and so her lines are frequently delivered phonetically. And so what you look at with The Fall, as many of you pointed out the other week, is you see like really genuinely spontaneous interactions between this little girl and this professional actor. Like you really get a sense that like not everything that you're seeing is totally scripted, that you're just watching authentic, spontaneous interactions play out. And that's because that's what you are watching. You are watching the magic that can happen when a non-professional actor is made to feel comfortable first, comfortable enough to perform and express emotion authentically and so on and so forth. But you're also seeing how really creative use of editing and creative acting on the part of the pro, who knows what he's doing, can interact with the non-professional actor's performance in a really, really incredible way. So it's again, like non-professional actors, if you just like put an actor in front of a camera or who's never done this before and say act, you're not going to get good results. But The Fall is able to get magic from this little girl's performance because they placed her in relation to the other performers, in relation to these other cinematic elements so brilliantly. And it ends up being one of the great performances in 21st century cinema, if you ask me. But yeah, great example of a non-professional performance. Okay, so that's your crash course on film acting. Now we get to talk about how some of these things apply to Do the Right Thing. So Do the Right Thing is a great film for talking about acting for two reasons. One, this is a film that is all about acting. This is a film that is literally titled Do the Right Thing. And it is a film that is very directly concerned and is intended to provoke this question of what is the right thing and how do you do it? Now, I use the word provoke very deliberately here because the film is best understood as a call to action. It is something that is trying very, very hard to produce not just a strongly emotional response in you, the viewer, but an emotional response that will translate into some sense of action on your part. And this is the other reason why the film is really, really great for talking about acting, because one of the ways it produces that effect of call to action, that response of we should do something about this, is by using a great range of different acting styles to energize the world of the film and by extension you, the viewer. Because the film is, as you know, concerned with a very, very pressing issue that we won't review too thoroughly here because I hope that you are all following the events of the last summer and this most recent fall. But the issues that are happening in Do the Right Thing were are sadly relevant 30 years later. I mean, this is a film that is coming out in 1989, 31 years ago, and it is still relevant in 31 years later. That is both a testament to the film's enduring power, but also a powerful indictment of the fact that we still have structural racism. We still have cops killing black people and getting away with it. We still have enormous political polarization around these questions in our society, and we still have people demonstrating their anger by taking to the streets, 30 years later. And it wasn't a new problem then. It was a problem that even then was old and went back, hundreds of years. So the film is directly calling upon us to do the right thing about these questions. But it is maddeningly vague about what the right thing actually is. Just a few more images for you from other protests that have been happening around these issues over the last several months. Particularly want to call your attention to the image on the bottom of Iowa City, because if you were here over the summer, if you followed the news, you knew that Iowa City was a very, very active place for demonstrations and protests, and there were a number of tense confrontations that could have been pulled straight from Spike Lee's film. And so again, this is the enduring power of his film, is that it allows us, it's still 31 years later, a really, really great place to think through this really, really huge problem that we face as a society. So this is a long way of saying that this is really best understood as a morality play about racism in America. And morality play is, I'm using this phrase very particularly too, because morality play it's like Spike Lee is not after a strictly realistic takedown and expose of what was happening in the late 80s and what is still happening today with black people being killed by the police without cause. He is making something that is deliberately and openly theatrical because, again, his ultimate goal is to challenge you to do something about this. And for Spike Lee, who, as you can see, is a very extravagant, theatrical man in real life, this is his Oscar suit that he wore to honor Kobe Bryant's untimely passing earlier this year. He's a very extravagant guy, and for Spike Lee, the best way to provoke an audience to action is through a theatrical approach to cinema. And so, this is my one of my soapbox moments. If you are not familiar with Spike Lee's filmography, do yourself a favor and check out some of these movies, because he, in addition to being one of the most vibrant social critics that we have in the filmmaking industry, he's also just got an incredible command of film style. Like, all of these films are just doing wonderful things with mise-en-scène, cinematography, editing, in the service of exploring some critical facets of American society, particularly our enduring obsession with race and racism. So he is a theatrical guy. And the film is not shy about telling you this in its opening moments. The very, very famous opening montage where Rosie Perez boxes the air while listening to Public Enemy's Fight the Power. I mean, this is the movie immediately is telling you, before a word of dialogue has been spoken, that you are not really getting realism in this film. What you are getting is theatrical stylization in the service of provoking catharsis in you, the viewer, provoking you through art to action. Film definitely continues this pattern of establishing its theatrical roots as you move through the opening sequences, where you see Samuel L. Jackson as Senior Dr. Lovedaddy. I may be getting that slightly wrong. Who functions as one of the film's Greek choruses. He is a character who is periodically wheeled onto the stage, like literally, he is like brought onto the stage to comment on the action and to contribute his distanced, seemingly objective, godlike take on the things that we're seeing. And you'll notice that he often comes in the film at like key moments where he's called to judge what the other characters are doing. The comic version of this dynamic comes up with the three dudes who sit on the side of the street and just make fun of everybody who walks by them. They're sort of like the comic version of Samuel Jackson's character. But it's another very theatrical device that this film is using. It's a Greek chorus. You see this same sort of thing in theater productions going back thousands of years, where you have a group of characters brought onto the stage between acts to offer us a respite from the action, but also a counterpoint to the action and a commentary on the action. And that's what these characters do throughout their time on the film. And then the other thing the film does periodically that is a very strong signal that the film is rooted in a theatrical tradition is it breaks the fourth wall. It has moments where characters appear to either directly address the camera or even in some cases directly address the audience. And this is something that you often see in theater productions. But here's the thing. Here's the thing about Do the Right Thing. What makes it so wonderful is that you see in so many of these moments the theatrical tradition being synthesized with cinema in a really powerful way. Like those images of Samuel Jackson's character and Rosie Perez dancing in the red stage. That's some of the most beautiful images you could ask a cinematographer to produce. And this moment here, if you remember in the film, it starts out as a conversation between Mookie and Radio Raheem, and then the camera very stylistically kind of pans away from Mookie, and you have this really sustained monologue by Radio Raheem. It's a really like bravura, showy moment where the film is showing you, hey, here's a camera, it's moving, check it out. And it's worth pausing here to foreground and spotlight the contributions of Lee's cinematographer, Ernest Dickerson, because Lee is really giving Dickerson a lot of freedom in this film to just go nuts. Like there's a lot of really pronounced ways that the film is indebted to a theatrical tradition. But there's also a lot of ways in this film where Dickerson is just doing like every trick in the cinematographer's playbook to bring you into the world of the story. Like you have like crazy filters being used throughout the production of this movie. One really interesting thing that you may not know about the making of this film, this was not shot in the summer. This was shot in a much colder months, and I think it was February that some of these scenes were shot. So it was not this hot out. But you feel like this is the hottest day of the year because Dickerson uses these red filters throughout the movie to imbue the images with a sense of heat. And that's really, really important because if you don't get the heat, you don't really get any of the other things that happen in this film, because it's the all-important backdrop to all of the anger, all of the emotion is the heat. And so Dickerson has an enormous responsibility to sell us on the illusion that this is actually the middle of the summer, even though it's not. And it's filters. It's filters and backlighting. You also have, in addition to crazy filters being used, a an enormous array of Dutch angles in the film. So we didn't talk about this a lot in the last lecture, but the Dutch angle is a tilting the camera. It's sometimes called a canted angle or a tilted angle. But you have these compositions throughout Do the Right Thing because they help to signify that you are looking at a world that is out of joint and that it is falling apart. It helps unsettle your perceptions long before any of the crazy stuff starts happening at the end of the movie. You also have cinematography being used very consistently to construct some of the side characters in the film, some of the characters who don't have as much screen time as the leads. So, for example, you often see Bill Nunn's character, Radio Rahim, framed in canted angles and using wide-angle lenses to bring him closer to the camera and kind of elongate some of the stuff around him. And these devices are used to represent characters like Radio Rahim or Buggin' Out, partly because we don't really have a lot of screen time with them. So one of the ways that we establish a strong impression of these characters is by using certain types of lenses consistently with them to accentuate certain features and so on and so forth. But it also helps to speaks to the themes of this film, which is how misperceptions and miscommunications can lead to really tragic violence. And here, in this moment, what you're seeing is really like Danny Aiello's character, Sal's perception of Radio Rahim as somebody who might be potentially menacing. And we know that he is not. We know that he is harmless, but at this moment, we are looking at him through Sal's point of view, and the lens allows us ever so slightly to see Radio Rahim as Sal sees him, as someone who is someone who is distorted by misperceptions and by anger and heat and so on and so forth. So again, Dickerson has an enormous responsibility in this film to use the resources of cinematography to flesh out the world of the film, to sell us on the illusion that these characters are really interacting in this really hot, heated space over the course of one fateful summer day. He's got to tell us about the characters who don't show up for more than 10 minutes of screen time. And he pulls it all off, which is one of the reasons that he eventually got to graduate, so to speak, to directing his own films. And these aren't films that have the same cultural cachet as Do the Right Thing, but it's worth pointing out that Ernest Dickerson is probably one of the most accomplished members of a group of black filmmakers who are working in the 80s and 90s in genre cinema. And so if you're looking for some good horror action, like B-level horror action, then you could do a lot worse than watching some of these films. Never Die Alone, Juice, Bones, really, really important voice in African-American genre cinema. Okay, so I'm going to now spend some time reviewing the different kinds of performance in Do the Right Thing. This will give us a chance to go back over the vocabulary terms from the beginning of the lecture and seeing how this film makes use of the various types of performance and characterization and casting that filmmakers can use in service of telling a story. The film really has, if you think back to that continuum of individualized versus stereotyped performances, one of the things that makes this film special is that it's very thoughtfully thinking about which characters will be individualized versus which characters will be stereotyped. And so what I'm going to do here is try to classify the different kinds of characters in the film against that continuum. And on one end of the continuum, we have the most individualized characters, probably being Mookie and Sal. These are the two characters who occupy the most screen time, get the most dialogue,
we learn the most about who they are as people. We have the greatest sense of what their long-term motivations are, or not, as the case is for Mookie. We learn, these are the most individualized character. They are utterly unique in the context of the film, and they don't really have like counterparts in other films in this genre. Like they are the most individualized characters in the film. And part of what makes this interesting is that if you look at these two very individualized characters, you see that they are using very different performance styles. Like one of the ways that Spike Lee and Danny Aiello individualize these characters is they are allowed to develop acting styles that other characters don't have in the movie. So none of the other characters has quite the same range of emotion as Sal, for example. Like Sal is one of the only characters in the film who we get to see when he is at his most boisterous and loud, and also then later see at his most quiet and gentle. We see him when he's funny. We see him when he's stern. Like he's got an enormous range of emotions that he's allowed to express. Mookie, by contrast, Spike Lee's character, does not have nearly the same range of emotions being kind of portrayed as Sal. He is much more, like his range of emotions is much narrower. Which is not to say he does not have emotion. He does, but like his range is much narrower than Sal. But he is individualized through other means. Like he is always seen wearing jerseys, often Jackie Robinson's jersey for the Brooklyn Dodgers, but a few others as well. He is the character who we most are apt to follow from scene to scene. So like he's given a lot of like structural prominence in the film, even though his emotional range is narrower than Sal's. And so again, like the point I'm making here is that the individualized performances are the ones that are the most unique in the context of that film. And that's not always the same thing as saying that that actor is doing quote unquote the most acting. You can say Danny Aiello is doing the most acting, but you can't really say Spike Lee is doing the most acting. You can say that they're both individualized performances, though. Two other individualized performances just to hammer home some of the complexities of how acting works in film. But here are two more characters who are extremely individualized in Do the Right Thing. Bill Nunn's Radio Raheem and Giancarlo Esposito's Bugging Out. So if you're a Breaking Bad fan, here's where I'm going to pause and say, there's Gus. There's Gus when he was a young man. Do you see it? It's crazy, right? Like totally different characters, but same actor. But anyway, these are two characters who don't have a lot of screen time in the film. Like you don't really see either of these characters for more than 15 minutes each, give or take. But you still have a very strong sense of them as individuals because they are very sharply drawn in relation to other characters. Their performances are like no other character in the film is allowed to hit those high notes and be as emotive as Bugging Out. And he is exclusively kind of depicted in a highly emotive state. And so that on top of the fact that he is frequently, but not always, framed from the same bizarre Dutch angles and using the same wide lenses as Bill Nunn's character, every time he shows up on the screen, he makes a strong impression. And we have a real distinct of him as an individual. We will not mistake him for any other character. And the same thing can be said about Radio Raheem. Like, he's not in the film very often. He only has a few lines of dialogue, but we have a strong sense of him as an individual because he is bigger than all the other characters. He is frequently framed using atypical camera angles, Dutch angles, wide-angle lenses. He's given a lot of authority and presence in the scenes where he does appear. It's a very individualized performance, but again, these actors have far less screen time than the stars, Spike Lee and Danny Aiello. So the point I'm making here is the individualized stereotype question is something that you have to think about in relation to the film holistically. Like, you have to be saying, like, okay, it's not a question of how much screen time they have necessarily. It's a question of how unique are they in the context of the film, and what are the performers and the cinematographers and the directors and the editors and everybody in the film, what are they doing to individualize that character in the context of the film? And as you can see, it's not always just so simple as saying that character has the most screen time or that character is the most emotive. It's a question of, what is the actor doing? Are other actors doing that thing? How is the cinematographer giving this character a unique set of lights, a unique set of angles, et cetera, et cetera. It's a whole. You have to look at everything. Is what I'm saying. Stereotype performances. So the film is full of stereotype performances, appropriately, given that it is a film about our own seemingly inability to rid ourselves of stereotypes. But the film is really thoughtfully, in most cases. In some ways, it's sort of shading over into caricature. But at its finest, the film is trying to use stereotypes in a self-reflexive, self-critical way. It's trying to get us to think about stereotypes in a very self-conscious way, if that makes sense. And so this is something you may find yourselves thinking about or debating in discussion sections when you talk about the film. But it is really an open question as to, like, when is the film simply using a stereotype because it's lazy and it wants us to use our own cultural associations to flesh out these characters, and there are a few moments where that's the case. Versus when is it trying to get us to see a stereotype as a stereotype so that we can be more on our guard when we find this stereotype in real life or in other media. And so I won't say too much more about that, except to say that, again, it's an open question. I'd be really, really curious to see what happens in discussion sections if you think about that. But Do the Right Thing is also notable for having not just a variety of different performance styles, but also for using a variety of different acting categories. So I'm going to review some of them in the next few slides, just to give you a sense of the film's thoughtful use of casting. But the film has a number of star performances. And this is, again, not the same thing as saying such and such character is individualized. Certainly, there are ways in which you could say that Ossie Davis's character, DeMayer, is individualized. But what's interesting about this character is this is a stereotype performance. Like, the character of the old drunken black man has been with us for centuries. It is a very, very old stereotype. It comes to us through minstrel theater and from African-American traditions of folklore and literature. It's just, you can find Ossie Davis's character, DeMayer, in so many different places. And the same thing can be said about Ruby Dee's character, Mother Sister. That is a very a character with a long history in African-American representation. So saying that these are star performances is not the same thing as saying that these are individualized characters who ground or headline the movie. They are stereotyped characters. But they're star performances because Spike Lee is casting Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee because he wants you to see Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee. Because if you are an audience, if you are one of his intended audience members, you know that Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee were big stars in African American cinema in the 50s and 60s. and spent a significant portion of their off time, not that they had much, protesting and campaigning for civil rights for African Americans. And so when Spike Lee is casting these characters or these actors as these characters, he is not really totally wanting you to see their character. In fact, he's casting them as stereotyped characters, partly because he wants you to notice the stars. He wants you to be like, oh yeah, the old drunk black man. Got it. Oh, Ossie Davis. Cool. This is interesting. Let's see what Ossie Davis does with this role. He wants you to notice them as the stars. So you have star performances in that's one good example of a star performance in Do the Right Thing is when actors are being cast, not necessarily because they are going to make the characters more believable, but because Spike Lee wants you to be thinking about this legacy of older African American actors fighting for civil rights while you are watching his movie. Another example of star performances, and this is an example of a star performance lining up with who is the most individualized character in the movie, but that's Spike Lee's performance as Mookie. And I say that this is a star performance because at the time that Spike Lee had made this film, he was already as well known, if not better known, for his public persona as a Dodgers fan, as a New Yorker, as a young black filmmaker with a strong point of view. He was already so well known for this image and this persona that he can kind of get away and do the right thing with casting himself as himself effectively. Just like you are meant to not really see Mookie, although Mookie certainly is a really individualized character, and you are meant to invest in him and identify with him and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, you are meant to totally see Mookie as just the latest name for the Spike Lee persona that he had been crafting in other films up to Do the Right Thing, that he had been crafting in a series of commercials that he made for Nike, that he had crafted in late night television appearances. Like Mookie was a version of the Spike Lee persona. And that's why, in addition to being a really individualized character who has a lot of screen time and is given a lot of interiority, and we are given privileged access to what he thinks about and what he sees, et cetera, et cetera. It's also a star performance because we're meant to see Spike Lee. We're meant to see the director. We're meant to see the filmmaker inserting himself into his own film, much like Orson Welles had done with Citizen Kane. So character actors who show up and do the right thing. And again, like you can see how this casting system that exists today is interacting with the idea of individualized performances and stereotypes in really complicated ways. Because you have here three actors, John Turturro, Danny Aiello, and Richard Edson, who are your classic example of character actors. Like you have seen these people in countless movies. Probably most likely you've seen John Turturro in something. He shows up in everything, it seems. But you don't always necessarily know their names. You don't necessarily know who they are when you see them, but you do recognize them, and a whole host of values and associations get triggered when you recognize them. And in this case, what gets triggered is these are like tough Italian guys, and they almost are always playing like tough Italian guys in the films that they're cast in. And so Spike Lee is casting them very thoughtfully for those associations as a means of triggering, like, oh man, Italian tough guys, like, oh, here we go, Sopranos and Goodfellas, Redux. But what he's also trying to do is he's trying to, within the context of character actors who are being cast with familiar associations, individualize these characters to a degree. Like most notably Sal. Like Sal, when the first time you see him, is a complete stereotype. Like he's talking to his sons and they're doing, it seems like an Abbott and Costello routine, just back and forth, like, hey. But by the end of the film, you have really gotten to see the full range of emotion in Sal. And you can still see how he is, to a certain degree, a stereotype who is being portrayed by a character actor who was himself typed for tough guy Italian roles. But you've also can see how that's just one side of who he is. Another great example of a character actor in Do the Right Thing is Samuel Jackson, who this might be a little tough for us to remember 30 years later, but Samuel Jackson was not a name when he made Do the Right Thing. He was someone who Spike Lee knew from his college days, if you can believe that, and was cast in some of his early films en route to the megastardom that he would later achieve with Pulp Fiction. But he's being used here in classical character actor status. He had shown up in enough films at that point that people were starting to get a little familiar with the Samuel L. Jackson persona, but we're not so familiar with it that it has become the defining thing. And so when the film was being made, this was like, oh, it's that guy. He's doing the thing that he always does, and brings a lot of history and associations to this very, very small role. Really fleshes out what could be, dead time, effectively, just sort of like redundant narrator kind of stuff. Samuel Jackson's bringing a lot of Samuel Jackson vibes to that role in a really cool way. And then the last category of actor that you see in Do the Right Thing are, of course, non-professional actors, most notably Rosie Perez, who went on to have a bit of an illustrious film career for about 5-6 years in the 90s, and then like so many actresses of color, struggled to find work once she kind of hit a certain age range. So she's really her career is really revelatory for what it says about how women and marginalized members of marginalized communities go through in trying to have a Hollywood career. But she was not a professional actor when she made this film. Spike Lee and his crew found her just kind of in the local community, kind of in and around where they were going to film the movie. And they cast her as the girlfriend. And it's a really, really great performance. But it is worth noting that in recent years, Rosie Perez, as you know from the reading, has come out and spoken critically about some of her treatment on the movie. She was not super thrilled about the nude scene that she has to do with Spike Lee's character, for example. And so even though her performance is really great because it brings a lot of authentic, just a sense of authenticity to the film that balances really nicely with the different acting styles that you see in the other characters. But her presence in the film is also another. It's sad and interesting for the ways it reveals how non-professional actors can sometimes be in a disadvantageous position working on these films, which is not the same thing as saying that people get straight up sort of exploited, in every sort of instance. That certainly doesn't happen every single time, but it happens a lot of the time that filmmakers will not always, with meaning so, but will often take advantage of the power that they have as pros in the business to pressure non-professional performers into doing things they may not want to do. So great range of acting styles in the film to think about, and different ways in which they're used. But why does all this matter? Well, I can't give you a fully fledged answer to that question, because I think the beauty of the film and film analysis is letting you kind of work that one out for yourselves in discussion sections. But my sense is that the film would be lesser if it had a more homogenized approach to performance and casting. If the film, one of the reasons the film is so effective on a dramatic level is because these different every actor is being cast very, very thoughtfully for what associations they will be bringing to the role and to the film. Every performance is very carefully modulated against every other performance so that very few of these characters really can be said to be acting the same way. Like Mookie's style and Spike Lee's style of performance and Danny Aiello's style of performance are completely different from one another. Yet they complement each other so brilliantly for being so different. And then the same thing can be said about all the other characters. Giancarlo Esposito's Bugging Out, Bill Nunn's Radio Raheem. All of these characters are so carefully cast for prior associations, stereotypes they might evoke. They're being cast because the filmmakers know their styles of acting will balance with what they're doing with the camera and what the other actors are doing. And I think this is just one of the reasons why the film works. I think this is one of the reasons why we feel when we watch this film as if we can identify or empathize with most, if not all, of the characters, while also seeing how misunderstandings develop that very quickly get out of hand and lead to tragic violence. Like, I think the film is very, very thoughtful about how it is asking you to see each of these characters as a different kind of individual, and to see how their individuality is just caught up in other characters' perceptions, which, as you know, can so easily be distorted and reframed by the heat, by the weather, by age-old misunderstandings and long simmering resentments, just anything and everything. So it's a really, really great film, and it's a really, really wonderful example of how film style can be put in the service of a really important issue in a way that will really, I think, galvanize, or at its best will galvanize you to act, to not just know what the right thing is, but to do the right thing, and to really think through what all the implications of that statement. So, a couple of discussion topics that you may consider writing about or discussing in your discussion sections, but signs of performance. You can never get too much practice applying Dyer's terms to the performances in the film. And this is not something we touched on as much in this lecture because we didn't have the advantage of looking at any scenes through this format. But I would say take a look at when you're watching the film, really be looking to see what actor is doing what with their bodies and gestures and facial expressions. You'll really start to see some typing and some individualizing of characters happening on that level. Acting in the context of other techniques. What are the performances doing with mise-en-scène and cinematography? Which characters are being framed with which lenses and filters and angles, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last thing that you may consider thinking about or talking about as you're thinking about the material are riffing on the points I was making at the end of the lecture about how these various uses of acting and performance are contributing to the film's thematic questions about racism, misunderstanding, anger, all that really important stuff. All right, y'all. That's all I've got. Hope you found this useful, and see you for the next lecture, which is on editing.